River Travel by Julia Schaefer. Table of Contents. The Best Way to Travel. Page 3. Chapter 1. The First Boats. Page 4. Chapter 2. Steamboats. Page 9. Chapter 3. Canals. Page 12. Conclusion. Page 14. The best way to travel. In 1800, the United States did not have good roads. Traveling then was like an expedition. Traveling a long way by road was a trek. So how did people travel? People used rivers to travel from place to place. Rivers were the nation's highways then. People explored new lands along rivers. They traded goods with other people living near rivers, too. How people used rivers tells a lot about the early life of this country. The United States has 3,500,000 miles of rivers and streams. Major rivers of the United States. Chapter 1. The First Boats. American Indians made the first boats. These first boats were hollowed-out logs called dugouts. Their name comes from an Indian word that means dug out. The Indians used paddles to steer the boat. The dugout canoe was best suited for use in calm water. Later, Indians made their canoes out of birch bark. These lightweight canoes were better in rivers with a fast current. A canoe under construction. The Indians made a frame out of bent saplings that were covered with bark. Some burned the inside of the canoe to make it waterproof. Lightweight boats were easier to steer. In a bark canoe, paddlers were able to steer quickly around logs floating in the river or sharp rocks. If they were traveling against the current, they used the paddle to push with all their strength. They could also use a sail. Against a strong current, they might get out and pull their boat through the water with a rope. But rivers still presented many problems to the Indians. The Indians used paddles to steer their boats. Rapids, rainstorms, and mountains. One big problem on many rivers was the rapids. Rapids are places along a river where the water flows very fast over rocks. Sometimes the cascading waters form a foam called white water. Whitewater rapids can knock a boat off its course or even flip it over. Riding the rapids requires skill. Indian paddlers had to plan their route in anticipation of the rapids that they knew were coming. Most tried to steer around rapids. Sometimes paddlers took their canoe out of the river and carried it around the rapids. No paddler underestimated the power or danger of rapids. Another problem on the rivers was the weather. During a storm, lightning could strike. A heavy rainstorm could fill and even sink a boat. Sometimes barriers, such as mountain ranges, blocked the river. So how did paddlers get around a mountain? They took their boat out of the water and walked on land until they could get back on a river to resume their journey. They carried the canoe upside down over their heads. If they had cargo, they carried that too. Paddlers had to carry their canoes around waterfalls. This journey over land was called a portage. That's the French word for carry. Often the portage was very tiring. Trading posts like this one were set up near major rivers. Sometimes these posts grew into cities. Trade, exploration, and settlement. Rivers were very important because they allowed people to trade goods. American Indians traded goods with each other and with Europeans. They used rivers to get from one trading site to another. They also used the rivers to get goods to trade. They hunted for edible animals and fished along riverbanks. Explorers traveled along rivers to find new lands. Later, people used rivers to move west, and then many settled near rivers. Chapter 2. Steamboats. In 1807, for the first time, a steamboat chugged along the Hudson River from New York City to Albany. It was the beginning of a major change. The steamboat made river travel easier than ever before. People were optimistic that these lofty new ships would transform travel and trading. And they did. Steamboats improved the prospects for river cities and the people who lived in them. As trade grew, more jobs were created. So people moved to river cities which grew wealthy. Flying sparks and smoke made steamboat travel dangerous. Steamboats became the way to travel and ship goods. In 1814, there were about 20 steamboats chugging along the Mississippi River. By 1834, there were 1,200 steamboats a year docking at the port of New Orleans. Cotton, sugar, and passengers filled the boats on their departure. In the Midwest, steamboats brought plows, seeds, and farmers to the newly settled lands. These sturdy boats traveled at a rate of about 8 miles per hour. That meant a fast trip. Every year, steamboats were improved so that they traveled faster. Farmers in the West shipped crops to the East. Factories and mills shipped goods to the new territories in the West. The mighty steamships were fulfilling their potential by connecting all the regions of the United States. Meet Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is called the father of the steamboat. He worked with Robert Livingston, and the two launched the first steamboat in 1807. Fulton also developed plans for submarines and canals. He died in 1815 while his steamboat was still king of the rivers. Chapter 3. Canals. People began to think of ways to connect the network of rivers and tributaries. One technique was to build canals. Many canals were built in the 1800s, connecting lakes and rivers. Canal building started slowly in the early 1800s, but by the mid-1800s, canals were being built on almost every large river. All canals work the same way. They use a series of locks and aqueducts to move boats. Aqueducts are like bridges. They carry the water of a canal over a river. Locks raise and lower the level of water in a river so a boat can pass through it. Meet DeWitt Clinton. DeWitt Clinton was the governor of New York when he had the grand idea of linking New York City and the Great Lakes with a canal. People laughed at the idea. They called the canal Clinton's Ditch. But once it was built, it was the wonder of the time. The Erie Canal was 364 miles long and had 18 aqueducts and 83 locks. Today, tourists visit the famous canal. One of the most famous canals is the Erie Canal. It connects Lake Erie with the Hudson River in New York. Before the canal was built, there was no way to ship goods to farmers in the West, and the farmers had no way to ship their crops to the East. The trips overland took too long and the crops rotted. With the Erie Canal, goods could be shipped faster and cheaper. Also, settlers could move to the west more easily. The canal opened in 1825. By 20 years later, about 4,000 boats used the canal each year. Conclusion. Rivers are no longer the superhighways of the United States. Today, we have paved roads for cars. Trucks and planes move people and goods faster than boats. Railroads ship goods around the country, too. Despite these facts, rivers are still very important. People still use river travel. They travel on the Great Mississippi and other rivers. They fish along riverbanks. People go canoeing for fun on rivers. And many people still live near rivers. Canoeing on a river is very relaxing. Responding. Target vocabulary. Word builder. What kinds of barriers can make it hard for boats, cars, and trains to move forward? In the chart below, list the barriers that might stop each form of transportation. Write about it. Text to text. Write about how people solved the problem of one of the river barriers. Tell what the barrier was, how it stopped river travel, and how people solved the problem. Use words from your chart in your writing. Target vocabulary. Barrier. Despite. Edible. Expedition. Fulfilled. Range. Resumed. Techniques. Trek. Tributaries. Target strategy. Monitor, clarify. As you read, notice what isn't making sense. Find ways to figure out the parts that are confusing. Word teaser. Use a vocabulary word to complete the sentence below. The polar blank departed from Alaska on June 18th. The blank leader expected to be at the North Pole by July 1st.